Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. This is a program where we talk about a number of things to do with media, communication, and we talk to people who are involved in the field of media and communication in all sorts of ways. Academics, researchers, consultants, activists, and indeed people who are engaged, if you like, in social movements, acts of resistance, as we might say, to draw attention to concerns of the day that may not get the kind of coverage that they deserve. So having said that, I'm delighted to welcome tonight Duncan McFarland from the US-China People's Friendship Association.
Thank you, Marcus. Really glad to be here.
Great to see you, and thanks for being here. I should add that you're from the New England chapter, or I think that's what it's called.
Yeah, it's a national organization, so I'm representing the New England chapter, not the national.
Excellent.
group.
Okay. All right. Well, here we are. We're broadcasting this in New TV in Newton, Massachusetts, which is definitely New England.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to talk to you about the association, which we can call the USCPFA, if you like, and use it as a way of explaining these questions, or the questions that emerge about friendship and the international relations situation between China and the United States. But let's start with the USCPFA, the US-China People's Friendship Association.
Right.
What is it? Let's go right back to basics, and can you tell us what it is? A little bit about its history, maybe.
Yeah, sure. It's a nonprofit educational association. It's a national organization. There are a couple dozen chapters. And it was founded nationally, I believe, in 1973. Right. After the big opening, when Nixon and Kissinger went to China and so forth. And, and there was a big opening toward China. There was a huge rush of interest in the United States of wanting to connect with China in different ways. Culturally, education, business, all kinds of people are interested in sort of reconnecting with China, since those connections had been broken off really in 1949, 1950, around and then. And so the association was founded as a people-to-people organization. So it's not, it's a non-governmental organization, and we think there's a lot of value in people's diplomacy, so to speak.
Oh, okay.
And in the 1970s and 1980s, very active and first promoting normalization of US-China relations, which was accomplished in 1979. And then in the 1980s, sponsored many exchanges, educational programs, and also did a lot of work hosting Chinese scholars who came to the Boston area and many other places. Didn't know much about the U.S., and so helping them with their day-to-day lives and so forth. So those are the kind of activities that we did back in the 70s and 80s. I've been a member since 1976. Recent times, however, with the downturn in official relations, the need for people-to-people relations, in my opinion, has grown greater.
Right, yes, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is the quite frequent references from Chinese people, from Chinese diplomats in particular, but also students that I know and other people, about this idea of people-to-people, the importance of people seeing China and meeting Chinese people. It's an interesting and fairly unique kind of pitch to make in some ways, isn't it?
Well, it is. And these days, the mainstream U.S. media gives a very one-sided picture of China, in my opinion, emphasizing the negative, not saying much about the positive. But when people, U.S. people and Chinese people actually connect, personally or even over Zoom, it's a very educational experience. Often when people go to China and tours are picking up again, they see something very different than they expected.
Well, certainly the case for me. The first time I went was, I think, 2007. I was invited by a colleague, a professor from Tsinghua University, so I was sort of entering at the top of the pecking order,
Yeah,
if you like, in the academic world.
Right.
And then I went back a few more times, and it really is extraordinary to have first-hand experience of it, because it's so difficult to get it's just like tourism, isn't it really, in some ways? It's hard to get a sense of what a place is like unless you see it with your own eyes.
Right, and some people say, well, you'll just be seeing government-arranged tour or something like that. Well, it's true that generally you would have a sponsor or a host in China, but there's also many opportunities for people just to go off on their own. For example, I was with groups of urban planners, and before dinner and after dinner for an hour, 2 hours, we would organize walking expeditions and walk all over the cities, including where people lived and shopped, and nobody restricted us from doing anything. So you can really, it's a huge place, but you can get a wide range of experiences.
One of the misconceptions I think that many people outside of China have had is a problem, and the misconception has created a problem that, it's an authoritarian situation where people can't walk around, where the notion of freedom doesn't actually exist, in the sense in which it's presented by the idea of what we think of as freedom, which I'm not sure how the two are disconnected, because the vast majority of people express freedom just by going to work and doing their work and coming home again, and going to the shops and so on. And that's the vast majority of experiences for people in this country, in the West, and in China as well. And yet the prevailing view is often, well, you're going to be surveilled and you're going to be threatened and you can't say this and you can't say that. I think that's probably a little quite misleading, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I've never experienced any restrictions on anything that I talk about or ask people about in China. Of course, you have to be tactful and considerate of their culture and so forth,
right,
and not adopt, an aggressive kind of accusatory tone. But one of our members has been working at the grassroots in China on environmental projects, and this is one of the things that the New England chapter has done. We've greatly think that people-to-people cooperation, specifically on climate change, carbon emission reduction, things like that, is very important, because China and the U.S., if they cooperated better on climate change and environment, that'd be a big plus.
Yeah.
And so this is an example of where we need cooperation, and people-to-people exchanges can be helpful. So this member has actually worked at the grassroots in the communities in China, and there's a tremendous amount of initiative just among the regular people in China on environmental issues. Right. They organize all kinds of protests if there's some issue with pollution and so forth. So it's there's a strong central government, but there's also a lot of activity, right, among the people.
And it is. Let's be frank. It is a different country. It is a different culture. It is not the United States of America.
That's the truth.
And sometimes what I think of as the imperial mind in the West especially tends to think that everything should be like us. And this has also been inverted, hasn't it, in that some good percentage of Chinese for a long time thought that if they came here they would be able to be that sort of transitional group that would be more Western than Chinese. I think that's gone away now, but you know what I'm saying?
They used to call China Gold Mountain, I believe. The Chinese used to call the United States Gold Mountain, I think, in the 19th century. So there are misconceptions on both sides. Yeah.
What about in terms of what we think of as the collective West? In other words, outside of the United States, what's your feeling generally about maybe other countries and their notion of collegiality and friendship with China? You get a sense that it's quite different compared to the United States, or is that just too broad to try and address?
Well, I think the Western countries these days are in a lot of ways taking their cues from the United States, where China is identified as a rival, at times a dangerous rival. However, if you go into the countries of the global South, I think you'll find a very different perspective on China. And in most of the countries of the global South, there are a lot of friendly feelings towards China.
Right. It seems pretty clear that there's a bit of a split, and I suppose we can talk. I know maybe I'll ask you a little bit later about this sort of multipolarity idea, a multipolar world that is somewhat different to what we have been accustomed to. But also I want to draw attention to this publication, which is part of the sort of effort of the Friendship Society.
Right.
And it comes out, every few times a year, 3 or 4 times a year?
Comes out quarterly, 4 times a year.
Quarterly, and it's a terrific resource. If you're interested in finding out about reporting on what's happening in China, the lead article here is about the building of railways, the HSR, high-speed rail, tens of thousands of kilometres of high-speed rail
Right.
throughout China, and produced with real sort of professional sort of sense of saying, look, this is just objectively clear that these developments are taking place and they're remarkable. And certainly people can see online, and there are accounts, I think, on most social media now of things happening in China on a regular basis. You can watch CGTV, like the Central Chinese Television.
That is an excellent source for contemporary news from China, CGTV. What I do is I read Western journalism, of course. I also read Chinese journalism. You might be surprised at how different they are in reporting on the same event.
I'm sure.
So I feel that the Western accounts emphasize the negative. The Chinese would often emphasize the positive. Put them together, that's how I get my balance.
Okay.
But if you want to know what's going on in China, don't just read Western sources.
Right.
You'll definitely be limited.
Yeah.
Because China is not the United States. It's not a Western country at all. Its entire cultural, historical roots are totally different and more ancient than the Western. So
Sure. Absolutely.
it's a very different place, which is why one reason I find it so fascinating, because it's constantly challenging me to think differently than I'm used to.
Right. Wonderful. And I think that's entirely fair, that we respect the dignity of others, right? And so respect the dignity of people who are not like us, who live in another part of the world.
That's the kind of Chinese key word in Chinese foreign policy: respect. All countries should respect others as equals.
Right. I'd be interested. This is a bad joke, but I'd be interested in seeing them doing a version of the old, RESPECT. Maybe Xi Jinping could do a version of that. That would be very interesting. As a way of saying, look, this is really fundamentally what it's about. But we I think are in a culture where we struggle, and I'm talking about Western culture as well as US culture, where we really struggle with the idea of respect for things that are different from us. We've had a very long run after World War II, I would suggest, of being able to say, you respect us. We're the hegemon. And that's no longer the case, is it?
No. China demands respect. Of course, for 100 years, from the Opium War up to 1949, they were constantly invaded and plundered and terrorized by the various colonial imperialist powers, and including Japan as well.
Yeah.
So China has a very long memory. That's different than the United States. I think our culture, we tend to sort of forget about what happened in even in the recent past. Chinese don't. They have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000-year-old history, which is very continuous and has ancient, what we call ancient events have a great deal of consideration in how they think about things today.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
A big difference.
Yeah, it is remarkable. That's true, and thanks for making that point. I wanted to turn to a bit more about the politics and media, particularly this question of how China is represented, or let's say misrepresented most of the time in the US and Western media, and how this is part of a larger set of questions to do with just US media coverage of China. And we could dive right in with a reference to Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's Manufacturing Consent, a famous book from 1988, where anti-communism is foundational to their model. There are several models around commercial media that's dominant in the United States. But the idea is that there's a filter on the US media. And one of these filters is that it cannot say anything positive about communism. It has to be anti-communist. The coverage is always there. And so there's this tremendous problem in that this seems to be reproduced with China, that nothing good can be said about China because it meets the standard in the manufacturing consent model of being communist, ergo it must be denied. It must be always negatively reported upon. And I'm wondering whether or not this sort of anti-communist approach is something that you recognise and you see as part of the challenge of how we address the whole question of China.
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with you on that point. For example, if you take the Taiwan question, and the association is based upon the one China principle. During World War II, it was agreed upon by all the allies that Japan would return Taiwan to China. Japan had conquered Taiwan, I think it was in the 1895 or something like that.
Oh, really?
That was agreed upon by all countries, including the U.S., unquestionably. And at that time, China was ruled by the Kuomintang, which was a capitalist, Western-oriented government.
Right.
As soon as the communist forces established the People's Republic of China, almost instantly, the U.S. switched its position on Taiwan and said, well, no, it's actually not part of China. But I think that was simply determined by the fact that a communist government had been established. And so that would be an example of anti-communism.
Right, yeah. And I think it's a good example that illustrates the long-standing opposition.
But I would also, however, say that it's very interesting when you look at China, also the Chinese in America, that there's this kind of ambivalence. There's this kind of contradiction. It's like we Americans can't really quite figure out what we think about China and the Chinese, because you can also look at periods where the Chinese were depicted very favorably in the press. For example, during the 1930s, when China was resisting the Japanese invasion, Chiang Kai-shek, when he visited the U.S., was accorded a greeting like a hero. It goes back and forth. The press in the 1980s was actually quite favorable on the whole towards China, but in recent years it's shifted back and is now very negative, back to the negative mode.
Right. Of course, one of the subtexts, if you like, was not very, very low below the surface, but a subtext is the US capacity to see China as a endless bank, right? A huge resource for making a lot of money. And so the finance and banking industry has done very well out of China.
Right.
And so they wanted free access to this massive market. So that's an
Yes.
important part of this narrative too, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And so that there are also business-oriented members in the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. one of our national board members is basically a business consultant in terms of the shift towards green energy creates huge exchange possibilities. China is a leader in manufacturing green equipment, such as solar panels and so forth. The U.S. has a lot of expertise, and so that is actually another channel.
Right.
So yeah, we've included some businessmen in the Friendship Association as well.
Yeah, it's great. And I think it's important to recognise that within the Chinese model of socialism, as it's been defined and redefined by the Communist Party of China, that there are these almost endlessly reinvented concepts of the role of business within the development of the society and in the role of culture in the development of society. It's actually quite complex, isn't it? And yet it's organised around a state model, which I think is a point of frustration for many people outside of China.
Well, yes, it is quite complex. China is full of contradictions. One thing that I think some of us in the U.S. tend to forget is China is actually a much bigger country than the United States in many measures.
Geographically, population-wise, or how do you mean?
Geographically, it's about the same, but population-wise, it's what, 4 times as big, something like that?
Nearly 4 times, yeah, that's right.
And
it's a lot of people.
And it's much older. So it's got huge cultural traditions, and so that's an important consideration as well.
Yes, yeah.
The sheer complexity and size of China can be kind of awesome, I guess I would say.
Yeah, sure. And there's certainly plenty of efforts made to what do you call it? I guess cherry pick parts of China, that are then shown up to be a cause for opposing it.
Well, that's exactly how much of this negative media works, as a matter of fact. For example, they cherry pick something that's not working well, and just sort of focus on that as if it's the whole. Now take the Belt and Road Initiative, with this huge infrastructure project. There's approximately $1 trillion worth of U.S. dollars of Chinese investment in these various infrastructure projects, primarily in the global south.
Right.
Now, I estimate they're 90% successful, which is a good, very good percentage. But that also means there's $100 billion worth of projects that aren't working very well. That gives a lot of fodder for those who want to focus in on all of those problems. There's a huge number of problems too. So if you highlight that part, you can make it sound like the whole project is not working, but actually it is working. So
yeah, and what it was a couple of years ago, the whole idea of doing away with extreme poverty didn't get much coverage. I think there was a PBS TV show that was made about it that was pulled. They wouldn't show on PBS.
Oh, that's an excellent example. Yeah, and in part because some people question that, and they said, oh, well, this is just propaganda. So there was a lot of investigation about what is actually going on here, and they actually found out that in terms of extreme poverty, that China had basically eliminated it, like 98, 99%. Only a few remote areas seem to be outside of this program. And extreme poverty, what that is basically defined as the basics of life. In other words, if you're worried about food or shelter, that's extreme poverty. So pretty much everybody in China has the basic necessities of life. taken care of. Now, of course, there's still a lot of rural areas in which migrant workers, and life is not easy.
No.
So we don't want to picture something too rosy. But you're right, that is kind of a historic event that was given virtually no publicity in the U.S. But you'll see that when you walk around Chinese cities. You don't see homeless people or sick people or hungry people. It's pretty amazing.
And what's also amazing, and I see we're coming to the end of our time, what's also amazing is just these new cities that have been built. I mean, the architecture, the engineering, the capacity to put very large numbers of people in relatively densely populated areas and provide them with all the resources is quite extraordinary. I mean, anybody can go and look at the photographs. Anything from the new Shanghai down towards Macau up through Beijing and other areas. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, too?
Well, it certainly is. I mean, Shenzhen and Guangdong in the south, I first visited in 1981. It was about 20,000 population. I went back and I think it was 1990. It was 10 million. Now I think it's 20 million. So coming in, developing later than many of the Western countries has enabled China to be very cutting edge in a lot of its high tech and architecture and so forth.
And the US government policy is really to say, on one hand, we're a competitor. They're competing with the United States. And I suppose as we wind up, the challenge will be how the competition plays out in the long term, wouldn't you say?
Well, right, and I think that China sees itself as returning to its historic position as one of the leading civilizations on the planet. I think they look upon it that way more than we're competing with the United States or any particular country.
Right. And I think that's a good point on which to end the idea of a different civilization, or the civilizational argument that some people make about China, that it's a very different option for how the world can be organised and how society can be organised. And thank you, Duncan, for enlightening us a bit and for telling us about the Friendship Society and the association, I should say, and for the opportunity to perhaps for viewers to see and understand more of the interactions and perhaps join the organisation.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus. I've enjoyed my time here.
Good, thanks, Duncan. And that's all for now. From me, Marcus Breen, and Boston Media Theory. Until next time, keep on leading.